All of us, I suspect, at one time or another have asked the question, what does it take to become wealthy? And I suspect that many of us have felt maybe a little guilty about asking that question. Well, I'd like us to define what wealth actually is, and then to consider whether or not we ought to feel guilty as we set about how to pursue wealth. Now, one way to define wealth is as the ability to acquire the things that we want and the things that we need. Of course, if you can't acquire the things that you need, then you're not only not wealthy, you're in poverty. And so really, once you get past that level, everything that's left is how much are you able to acquire of what you want. That's what wealth is. Well, is that a bad thing to want that? Well, I want to suggest that the Bible does in fact create and give warnings against a desire, that too deep of a hunger for these things. That we can be greedy, that we can be overly acquisitive, that we can be unhappy with the providence of God and where He's placed us. That in fact, wealth can become an idol to us. But that doesn't mean that wealth in itself is a bad thing. In fact, the Bible not only does not say that wealth is a bad thing, but the Bible presents wealth as for what it is, a blessing from the hand of God. And therefore, we shouldn't be ashamed about wanting to acquire wealth for ourselves, far less if we have a desire to see not only ourselves become wealthy, but our entire nation. We want to live in a land of prosperity. In fact, Adam Smith, who was the first modern economist, his magnum opus, his great work, is entitled An Inquiry into the Causes and Nature of the Wealth of Nations. These are the kinds of things that we're interested in pursuing, and that's perfectly appropriate. And to understand how we get there, we want to consider some basic fundamental principles. But before we do that, I want one more caveat for us. There may be those that feel that somehow that as I get more wealth, that necessarily means you get less wealth, or as you get more wealth, I get less wealth. Remember, what we're talking here is about principles that create wealth. We want to grow a bigger pie rather than talk about who gets how big of a slice. So what's that first principle? Principle number one is that God made us for work. Now, when we say that, I hope it's pretty obvious to us. He calls us to work in the garden. He calls us to work after the garden. That calling is not generic. It's not merely you're a man or you're a woman, you're supposed to work. But rather, God, in calling us to work, does this beautifully by calling each of us to a particular kind of work, what we call a vocation or a calling from God. He gives us different gifts, different abilities, and His providence, He puts us in different circumstances, and so calls each of us to be about the work of exercising dominion and of creating wealth. Principle number two simply asserts that work is productive activity. It's certainly possible to be active without being productive. I don't think it's possible to be productive without being active. But that's what work is. It's when we're engaged in molding and reshaping and the exercise of dominion under God's authority, taking what He has given us and changing it, shifting it, and creating from it the kinds of things that we want or need. That's what work is. It's basic, it's foundational, but it's vitally important, of course, to the foundation of the creation of wealth. Right after that is this other important, critical, basic principle, and that's this, that man owns what he produces, that we own the fruit of our labor. Now, there's other ways to own things. We can acquire things by finding them or in other means, and we have other senses of ownership. But in terms of production, we want to remember that man owns what he produces, that private property is real, and private property is part of the engine of the creation of prosperity, the creation of wealth. When we're engaged in the production of wealth, what we're producing, broadly understood, are economic goods. And in the creation of economic goods, there are always going to be engaging, intermingling three key factors of production. The first one of those factors is, broadly speaking, in technical terms, land. Now, when we say land, we don't just mean a plot of ground. Instead, we're talking about essentially the whole of the created order, which includes things like sheep. And what's on the sheep's back but wool? And wool is a part of how we get to getting Aaron Claire ready to knit. But the wool in itself isn't going to do the job. You have to take not only the creation, not only the land, but you take the labor that God has given us. And there are those who will labor with the sheep to remove the wool, to clean the wool, to wash the wool, to dye the wool, to spin the wool, to create yarn. Now, yarn then becomes the third tool here, the third mechanism by which we produce. It is a capital good. Now, capital means the head or the source of the end goal. Capital includes a multitude of things, but broadly speaking, what we're talking about are those things that we use to create other things. It's a step back in the process. One of the most critical and foundational parts of this is what we call tools. Tools are how we take the land and the labor and turn them into other things. But tools themselves have to be made. Tools are made by tools. Think about, in Aaron Claire's case, how knitting needles are made. The first thing that has to happen involves the land, where we're gonna dig a hole in the ground and we're gonna find iron ore, and that iron ore is gonna be processed and turned into steel, and that steel is gonna be turned into knitting needles themselves. But then those knitting needles still have to be moved to the marketplace. They're going to be put on a truck. The truck is going to ship them to the store. And in the store, with money, which is another form of capital, but we're going to get to that later, in that store, Aaron Claire is able to buy those needles in order to make that scarf. Given the complexities it took just to get wool and talent and knitting needles together in one place, we surely should come to understand that no one person, especially my little girl, could create all that they need in order to be about the business of their work. Which brings us to our next principle, that in order to get where we need to go, in order to be productive, we need to be able to exchange goods and services one with another. When Aaron Claire bought the needles, when she bought the yarn, she was engaged in exchange. And in fact, she was engaged in a mutually profitable exchange. Remember, we said the creation of wealth is not a zero-sum game where one man's loss is another man's gain. When she made the trade, she would rather have the tools, the yarn and the needle, than the money. The store from which she bought these things would rather have the money than the yarn and the needle. So corporately speaking, our wealth increased because everybody has, after the trade, what they valued more than what they had before the trade. But that's something we'll talk about later. What we want to get now, first of all, is that in order to get what we need, we have to engage in trade. And that trade happens in every step along the way. Trade happened with the digging of the dirt and the driving of the truck and the driving of the truck to the store. Trade's going on all the time, millions of times in any place where we have a free exchange. And out of this comes not only the creation of wealth, but the distribution of wealth. Well, what becomes of all that we produce, all of these economic goods that are the fruit of our labors? Well, some of them are consumed. And really, that's okay. We have to eat. It's a good thing to eat. We wear clothes, we drive cars, we buy music. All of these things are okay. But we have to recognize the danger that's lurking behind all of this. We have to remember our next principle, which reminds us that we have to save in order to accumulate capital to be used in more complex production. Now, friends, this can't be overemphasized enough. If you want to look at it in maybe more biblical sort of wisdom kind of terms, this is the principle that if we consume more than we produce, we will end up in poverty, no matter what we think, no matter how complex we might think we might want things to be. If we consume less than we produce, then that is the way we're able to produce more and to increase our wealth and to prosper. Now take that principle and multiply it 1,000,000 times, and what you have is the wealth of this nation. That we are a prosperous country precisely because we have made choices to consume less than we have produced, and so that we have accumulated capital to create more complex production. So out of this comes cars and shopping centers, and all good things that we're enabled and allowed to enjoy. So whether it's producer goods or whether it's things that we consume, whether it's shopping malls or candy bars, all of these things come about through the complex interrelationship of land and labor and capital. All of these things come about through economic decisions and choices, either wise or foolish. It's all God's providence governing His world. We've been considering so far those basic principles that help us move from work to wealth. We looked at the calling of work. We looked at the things that we work with land and labor and capital. We looked at the reality that we consume, and we looked at the importance of savings. But Adam Smith, when he was asking the question, what is it that makes a nation wealthy, he begins his own exploration by touching on a principle that we haven't gotten to yet. Adam Smith said in that opening chapter, if men work together and cooperate, they can combine their land, labor, and capital to greatly multiply their abilities to produce even greater and more complex things. Furthermore, they can specialize in what they're best at producing. This is called the division of labor. And it too has been a powerful weapon in increasing our prosperity, in increasing our work. And in fact, it's given us the blessing of more specifically being able to pursue the calling that God gives each of us individually. There are two principles and sort of potent motive powers that come out of this principle of division of labor that I want us to not miss. First, the sheer division itself is going to increase, it's going to multiply our efficiency. Isn't it the case in general that simple cooperation will make us more effective, will make us more efficient, will make us therefore more productive? That if we were to just at random pick 3 of my children to divvy up the work of the dishes, it wouldn't merely take the first amount of time for one person and divide it into 3 parts, but each of those 3 parts might be likely to be less. That cooperation is going to decrease the amount of work that goes into the doing of the dishes. But here's what happens. As the children begin to cooperate, we begin to discover that, someone is a little better at this part of the process and someone's a little better at that part of the process. My teenage son is probably going to be a little less careful about fully scraping the dishes, but he's going to be a whole lot more effective at taking the big pile of plates and lifting it up to the top shelf than his little tiny sister. So when we have specialization in our work, we have another boost in our productivity, because when we do what we're better at, we do better at it. This fills in or touches our back on the idea of our calling. Not only do we do things more efficiently, but we're going to find that we actually enjoy our work more, which means there's going to be fewer thorns and thistles that we have to deal with. Now that said, there's a third and important point we don't want to miss too, and that is what multiplies our efficiency through the use of tools. Looked at it from this perspective, because of their cooperation or because of their use of tools, my children ended up saving time in the washing of the dishes. Now, what are they going to do with that time? One of them, I suppose, might go off to do some homework. Another one might go off to spend some leisure time, maybe reading a book. Aaron Claire might go off and start knitting. That's what happens when we're able to save our time. We're able to do more of what we want, to produce more of what we want, and to enjoy what we've already produced. Which leads us to our next principle. Capital, in the form of tools, enables us to produce things of greater complexity that we might otherwise not have been able to create. Well, what do I mean by tools? Well, tools is a pretty broad category. It includes everything from a simple hammer to a factory that produces cars, from a computer to a massive earth-moving truck, even to a hydroelectric dam. All of these things are tools because they're able to increase our productivity. Even the little knitting needles that Aaron Claire got are tools. Imagine the scope and the size of the increase of her productivity. We went from 0 to something Because without these tools, she simply couldn't knit anything. And with them, she can. But let's consider even this. As much as the tool increases her productivity, how much can one person do compared to a whole factory? If Erin Claire were to make a scarf herself, she would have to acquire the yarn that she needs. She would need to have the tools and the knitting needles, and she would have to invest the time and the energy and her skills. And it would take some effort, as good as she might be. But the astonishing thing is that we live in a world where you can walk into a store and buy a scarf to keep you warm for under $10. Well, why is that? It's because of the principle of mass production. And here's what happens with the prices because of mass production. Our latest principle says, when goods are mass produced, the increased quantity drives prices down, which enables them in turn to be purchased by still more people. That's the glory of mass production. Not that I have a massive amount of new stuff or you have a massive amount of new stuff, but that massive amounts of people are able to enjoy the blessings of what's produced. We actually take advantage of this on a daily basis. When you go into the grocery store, the food that you buy in some manner is likely mass produced. When you buy something online, it's probably something that was mass produced. All of us buy things that are mass produced and are delighted to do so, in part because of the lower prices. Who, after all, doesn't like lower prices? Let's see if we can tie all of this together. All of these principles come together to remind us of how we get from work to wealth. Here's how it works. Private property plus free exchange plus savings plus division of labor plus tools plus mass production plus lowered prices builds on itself in an upward spiral, resulting in greater and greater wealth and prosperity for everyone in an entire society. Remember that we define wealth as the ability to acquire the things that we want or need. When prices drop, more of us are able to buy more of what we want and need. Remember that the glory of what we're talking about here isn't simply that the rich get richer. The glory is that those at the bottom of the economic ladder are lifted up, or get to enjoy greater and greater prosperity. When again you look across history, you see precisely that. Those nations that understood these principles, that were grounded in the wisdom of the Protestant Reformation, enjoyed prosperity because of the application of these principles, and that prosperity was not the haves at the expense of the have-nots, but it was the blessing to the have-nots, so that we became the most wealthy nation in the history of the world. How easy it is for us to take for granted what we have, to forget how we got here, and to find ourselves forgetting these principles and therefore destroying wealth instead of creating it. Now, there's one other thing that needs to be said. These work together only in a context of law, of peace, of protection. All of these economic laws are grounded in, again, moral laws, including God's call to the state to protect our lives, to protect our property. When you have those parameters established, then we're able to be productive, which creates, again, not merely more wealth for the wealthy, but more wealth for everybody. It's not a zero-sum game. Our desire is for prosperity for all men, because what we see when we enjoy the prosperity is all sorts of other blessings that come with it. When we're more wealthy, we're able to finance the spread of the kingdom of God, as we've seen in the modern missionary movement. We're able to be more engaged in essentially non-economic cultural manifestations. If we have free time, we're able to make beautiful music or to make beautiful paintings, these cultural expressions of dominion that maybe are slightly outside the economic realm happen when our needs are met by the prosperity that comes from the engines that God has established for all of us, We see it, we witness it, we live in the midst of it in the Western world. Which brings us finally to this principle. The only way for us to enjoy this is for us to be grateful to God for